I think the key takeaway for me is to make sure that this content process isn't a one-off. It isn't a publish and forget. It is a publish and manage, constantly looking at your content as an ongoing process. Hi, I'm Richard George. This is SEO in 2026, additional insights.
Richard, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
I want to focus on content decay. We spend significant amounts of time researching, writing, both humans and AI, building and publishing content. Yet many treat content as kind of like a publish and forget mindset. So we need to fundamentally change that in 2026.
Okay, so how do you identify ineffective content?
That's a very good question. It's kind of three stages. You have the disease, the diagnosis, and the cure. We need to talk about the disease first of all and try to understand why content decays in the first place. We've worked with brands, both UK and internationally, over the last decade, and they've invested significant amounts in content and their content strategies. And yet, content can become old and can become out of date quite quickly, especially in sectors like travel or like finance, where you're looking at changes in regulations, changes in what's happening in the global markets, changes in the economy. You need to bring your content up to date because you'll also see your competitors having more mature content strategies. And also, the web's changing significantly, especially in the last 12 months with AI. So search algorithms are more complex, more easy to understand content. So if you don't have focus on your content, you're not going to be successful in this multi-platform search ecosystem world that we now live in.
Okay, and are there any particular metrics that you look at in order to establish if a piece of content is worthwhile keeping or not?
Oh, there's lots. So first step is you need to identify all your content. So crawl your website, get GA data, get GSC data. At page level, build out the starting sort of a huge spreadsheet, depending on the size of your website, and then look at getting linked data at a page level, and then identifying for each page the search interest, the topics that you're wanting to target. But then also add an additional set of data for the human aspect. Because if you've got a huge website, like thousands and thousands of pages, this can be quite a daunting task. So what you also need to do is overlay that human layer, because there may be content that's produced for brand or for partnerships or for PPC landing pages that if you're just simply looking at the data, it may not have a great deal of sessions or performing particularly well, but that might be for genuine reasons.
Okay. And I'm intrigued by this maybe document that you produced that collates all the content on a website. Are you talking about every single page, no matter how big or small it is, in terms of volume of content and in terms of whether or not there's actually intention to drive traffic to that page? And is there any particular form that document takes? Like, is there software that you use to do that, or is it a fairly manual process in terms of spreadsheets?
Exactly. I mean, what you need to do is basically create a full map of your website, every single page, like you say. So you can use tools like Lumar or Screaming Frog to crawl the site initially. You can pull in your analytics data from Adobe or GA. You can use your Search Console data as well to understand every single page, how it's performing at a sort of session level. Because what we're looking for in content decay is we're looking to see, ideally over sort of 12, 18 months, if not longer, are pages starting to decline in performance before we can start to really get under the skin to understand why that page is underperforming. And like there could be genuine reasons why that page is underperforming. So there's a lack of search interest, for example. Topics in 2020, 21 around COVID are no longer relevant anymore, for example. But there could be other reasons where you need to refresh that page, bring it up to modern EAT standards and principles. You need to adopt things like authorship onto the page to help that page perform. So first of all is you need to get all this data in a position to allow you to do that quantitative analysis before you can then look at the qualitative analysis afterwards.
I guess the big challenge is, as you've alluded to, so search has changed massively over the last maybe 12, 24 months or so. The advent of AI search and obviously people finding more answers that they're looking for directly on the SERP as opposed to going to a website. So those reasons that you highlighted there are all exceptionally relevant in terms of identifying which piece of content is likely to be decaying in terms of performance. But how do you determine if it's decaying as a result of maybe natural aging of the piece of content and perceived less relevance versus changes in in user behavior on the SERP because of new technology?
So I think you can address that in two parts. I think, first of all, you're looking at changes in the SERP itself, such as AI overviews or even Google's AI mode, and how that's analyzing and digesting the content in the first place. If the content's been decaying, you can track that through the data you get within this sort of keep, kill, merge, refresh type audit, this huge content audit. But then what you can also do is you understand the topic of each of those pages, and then you can see if AI overviews are starting to appear for each one of those topics that you're trying to focus on and target for those pages. So you may start to see a decline in actual click-through and from the visibility because AI overviews are appearing. But on the flip side of that, large language models like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini, they're using the web and the web's content to learn from. So if we've got a web that has large percentage of content that is out of date, these large language models are creating negative biases because they're learning from outdated content.
Now, one phrase that you mentioned there that I'd love to go back to is keep, kill, merge, refresh, audit. So I've heard of that before, maybe talked about it briefly before, but in terms of the context of content and whether or not a piece of content is likely to be worthwhile keeping or doing something with moving forward, how do you use that framework to make that decision?
Again, the spreadsheet is the base of that, or the data we've got is the base of that. And I said there are tools available. Like I said, we crawl like Lumar, Screaming Frog. There are other tools that you can analyze, such as Keyword Insights and ClearScope, which will help you look at that content decay. Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to create a content governance roadmap. So you've got all this data, you've gone through, you've seen the content that's either performing really well, not performing, or there's content that, like I said, is brand or partnerships that you don't need to focus on as much. But what that gives you is a blueprint that tells you what you're going to keep, because we don't need to do anything with it. There may be content that's out of date, there's no search interest, or it's just an old piece of content relative to a topic that we don't need anymore. That can be killed and redirected. And then you can merge. Sometimes we've seen examples, especially in travel sector, where you've got two topics created by different stakeholders in the business, but it's very similar. So they're competing against each other. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is reduce the site loads, create a cleaner site, create a simple list of gold, silver, bronze tiers of content that you can build out into your content strategy. And then you can have a content governance over that. So any stakeholder who has anything to do with publishing content on your website, you know about it and you know what its importance is.
Would you ever advocate 404ing an old piece of content that perhaps hasn't had any traffic for a while, isn't getting any obvious rankings at all, rather than actually 301 redirecting it?
It depends on the page metrics, because if you've got, let's say that page has got no search traffic anymore, there's no search interest, but say, for example, it has attracted some links in the past, then it'd probably be worth redirecting it to a similar or relevant page that still exists on the site. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is clean up that site. So I'd probably look more on the redirect rather than just simply 404ing that page.
Okay, and in terms of merging pages, how will you make the decision to ensure that the pieces are quite relevant in terms of likely user preference or user desires?
Again, you'd take a look at those page elements and page data. So are the topics very similar? And maybe even where they are in the navigational hierarchy on the side, looking at the performance of the page, like engagement metrics, as well as not just the sessions. And then using tools to bring them together. So there's tools like ClearScope, like Keyword Insights, some of the tools that use Google's natural language processing to analyze that sort of relevance and semantic relevance of the content. So if you're bringing them together to create one really strong page on that topic, rather than two that are competing against each other.
And what about refreshing? So if a page is dropping, what elements will you try to freshen up to try and reverse that trend?
They're again looking at some of the tools I just mentioned there, but also looking at adoption of other techniques. So what hopefully you've got from this huge audit process is you've got your content on your site categorized by gold, silver, and bronze. So let's take your top product pages. These you may need to look at refreshing or just analyzing every 2 or 3 months. For other content, it may be every 12 months. So what you can do looking at those pages is looking at things like, could you bring authorship onto the page? And if you are bringing authorship, who are the authors and what are their bios and expertise? Analyzing that page against Google's EAT principles. And again, using tools and techniques like Keyword Insights and ClearScope to look at how relevant your content is for that topic against your competitors in the market.
That's interesting that you mentioned perhaps refreshing a piece of content maybe every 12 months, or if it's not that important, perhaps more often if it is. I was thinking that you might just focus on refreshing a piece of content based upon performance on the SERP, and if there was an obvious drop, then just dive in and do something then. Do you think in general that, for instance, you would refresh a piece of content if there wasn't any significant changes in its performance in the SERP?
I think that is getting yourself into that habit, getting your business to understand the value and importance of content. So if you're looking at, and we know this from working in the financial service sector, where a number of the sort of price comparison services we worked with, they would schedule content analysis on a probably 6 or 8 week basis on the hero pages, on the top sort of category pages. So if you're looking at things like car insurance, life insurance, home insurance, and they would look at analyzing on that regular basis and even do things like, okay, if you've made a change, you update that page and you change the actual refresh date on the page. They would also use authorship on the page and authorship for whoever has looked at, reviewed, and refreshed the page. Then in these super competitive sectors where these marginal gains type of approaches can make a difference, setting that routine and getting into that routine on that sort of process is key to driving success. But then it could be a blog page in the travel sector that may not need to be looked at until every 12 months, because it could be travel trends for 2023, for 2024, for 2025. And these are our top travel trends. You just need to tweak it and update it potentially if you're keeping that piece of content as an evergreen piece of content.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it also leads into content strategy as well, doesn't it? Because I guess a relatively novice content producer would write a great blog post on travel trends for 2025 or 2026, and without actually viewing future years as part of the strategy and have an overarching vision there. And perhaps if they select a URL that doesn't incorporate the year, and it makes it a little bit easier to update that particular URL and just use it, as you mentioned, for future years, 27, 28 as well, moving forward, if there's a lot of authority that eventually passes to that link.
Yeah, or the better example could possibly be around sort of visa. If you're looking at the travel sector, sort of visas or travel restrictions, if you create a single page, but that changes on a regular basis or an annual basis, depending on what's happening in the world economy. So what we're trying to do again is trying to, create a simple, clean, strong site that is authoritative on a topic. And in those examples, that's more around the evergreen. But going back to the sort of financial services, those are pages that you need to just look at on a regular basis. So, I mean, another example we had as well is the changing in algorithm and the changes in the way Google was valuing content. Actually removing a percentage of the content off the page and reducing that down saw significant impact in performance. I think that was in the life insurance sector. So actually, more content isn't always the best. You've got to use the tools, you've got to use the analysis, you've got to look at the SERP results, you've got to look at the competitors, and taking all these different data points to actually come up with that real insight, because ultimately this thing is what's going to drive the performance.
Have you actually changed the way that you suggest content to be produced or tweaked it a little bit over the last year or so? For instance, I'm thinking that with more AI search engines, perhaps the incorporation of a summary of the piece of content towards the beginning may assist those types of search engines. So is there anything like you've done like that's tweaked the structure of the content to perhaps be more relevant nowadays?
Yes, we have. We've taken, again, let me use the example of the travel sector because this is one that's top of mind. We took a lot of analysis around to see whether the brand we were working with was within our overviews or not. And a great example was around, I think it was a travel guide to Costa Rica. And if you're looking at the AI overviews, the brand wasn't visible in the AI overviews. So what we did is we looked at the competitors and we looked at the way that the questions were being answered in the SERPs. And what happened was, instead of having a long article that just talked about the best times to go, the SERP was answering it by saying January to March, April to June, July to September, and so on. So we restructured the content on the page into these clear sort of monthly segments, what to do, and then bringing in things like simple tabulated or bullet point type answers of what to do at the best times to visit. And then that impacted the performance of the content in a positive way and started to get us into the AI overviews. So using that data to analyze not just your content, but how the SERP is responding, and then editing your content to try to match those different sort of techniques, came up with a positive response.
Richard, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
I think the key takeaway for me is to make sure that this content process isn't a one-off. It isn't a publish and forget. It is a publish and manage, constantly looking at your content as an ongoing process.
Richard George is Head of Organic Performance and Managing Partner at Wavemaker. Find out more over at wavemakerglobal.com. Richard, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.